Hey folks, Kevin here. Well, it's March 6, 2022. In today's video, I'm going to give you my 2 cents on the diesel emissions regulations and the new equipment that we're purchasing nowadays. Recently, when you go to buy a new tractor, things have changed drastically since when I first bought tractors back in the 70s and 80s, and heavy equipment, a dozer back then as well. And one of the things I would say is tractors nowadays, there's subcompact tractors, lots of compact tractors and all, and because of the emission standards, trying to reduce the amount of harmful compounds that are put into the atmosphere, and certainly causing global warming as well. Because of these emissions, the Environmental Protection Agency has made restrictions on manufacturers. And there were some really rough hurdles that the manufacturers went through, especially the big semi-trucks that you see. Tractors had a shorter version. There still are some issues with some vehicles as well. But the reason that I'm going over this video is, one, I'm going to give you my health perspective on it. Two, I want you to realize that I see a significant difference in our ability to breathe around the newer equipment that's out there. For example, we have two tractors, or Kubota tractors, that are less than 26 horsepower. So we have Mini Me, which is a B2601. That's Thea's small tractor with a front end loader and all. And then we have a zero-turn diesel Kubota tractor as well. And so both of those fall into the final Tier 4 emissions. And I'm going to play a video in a couple of moments from Neil from Messick's Equipment. And I think he does a really good presentation of some of the emission standards as they've rolled out over time. I know there's lots of people that really poo-poo the whole regulations that have been there. I cheer it on and look forward to even more changes coming in the future as well. And I'll make a video about fuel efficiency and the economics associated with running diesel engines at this point. But one of the things is that what we're seeing with these compact and subcompact tractors, we're seeing lower horsepowers in larger tractors. And so it can be very, very confusing. So we can get a larger tractor, bigger than Mini Me, which is a compact tractor, that actually has the same engine as Mini Me, but it has different functions it can create on your property. So those are things just to be aware of, that it used to be the size of the horsepower sort of got larger as the pieces of equipment got larger as well. But again, I'll try and make a video about the hydraulics, the RPMs that you're running equipment at, and the reasons for running your throttle at certain speeds, depending if you're running a snowblower, a wood chipper, you're doing front-end loader work, and those sorts of things. So as I mentioned, we have two pieces of equipment that fall under the 26 horsepower limit. And then we have a couple of pieces of equipment, which is Optimus Maximus, which is the Kubota L6060. And that's the one you've seen videos of me doing snow blowing recently. And then we also have the Hulk, which is a Takeuchi, not the Hulk. We have Elon, which is a Takeuchi TB290. This is an excavator, and that falls between the 25 and 75 horsepower range, which does require a diesel particulate filter, and that's where active regeneration it happens every once in a while if you're not running the vehicle at a high enough RPMs to burn off the soot that accumulates in the filter, the diesel particulate filter. Excuse me. So by having excess pieces of equipment that are after the engine, it adds a lot of cost to the engine. And if not maintained properly, in other words, if you aren't running the regeneration cycles or you're not running the motor at high enough RPMs, then it can be costly as well. Then I have one piece of equipment that not only has a diesel particulate filter, but also has DEF as well. And I'm going to go over, well, Neil's going to go over it, and I may have time to go over some other things as well. So that's the Hulk, which is a Takeuchi TL12 V2. That's a heavy-duty track loader. So that, because of the horsepower of that engine, it does require the DEF fluid being added, and these are both the diesel particulate filter and the DEF solution are both post-engine adjustments. So I think what I'll do now is just share. So one of the things I've talked about in videos in the past is one of the reasons what we want to have so much foliage on the trees around, and why we grow some of the trees and the living fence lines that we do is to help with some of the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And here's some pictures here. And these are benzene rings in various combinations. And these could cause certainly lung disease, other types of cancer, lung cancer as well, chronic inflammatory conditions, oxidative injury and all. They do DNA damage. So there really are a host of problems associated with these incomplete combustion byproducts that are so small, and you'll hear terms like PM10s, PM2.5s, and PM2s. What we're talking about are these hydrocarbons that are not completely broken down, and that's one of the things we want to do with the equipment. One of the things I'll say with the equipment, like in my back shop, I'll fire up this time of year. I'll fire up with just two doors open, two overhead doors open, Optimus Maximus, which is the Grandel 6060 with the snowblower in the front. I'll fire it up and let it run for a while before I let it get warmed up, get the hydraulics all warmed up as well, before actually starting to run the tractor itself. And it's inside of a building with doors open. There is a huge difference, even with Mini Me, the B2601, between what the smell and how we feel with our respiratory systems. There's been a huge change since using, like Optimus Prime, which was a Case 995, a large diesel tractor. So the exhaust fumes that came out of the older equipment certainly were much more noxious to my health, and that's one of the things: self-care, earth care, people care, and future care. Those are our four ethics. So I just wanted to mention, we have these particles that are so small they are airborne. One of the good things about having lots of foliage on trees, and then those trees are deciduous trees that drop their leaves in the fall, the fungi can break these down and decompose them. So that's one of the reasons that we have the living fence lines. We have so much forested area, and we certainly want to have a food forest as well. So that helps to deal with it after it's being produced. So we're going to a video by Neil from Messex Equipment, and I think Neil goes over this pretty darn well.
I participate in a lot of Facebook groups and internet message boards about tractors, and lately I've been having a bit of a pet peeve. So every once in a while I see guys referring to tractors as having no emissions. And that is just simply factually, in most cases, wrong in the references that they're making. Tractors and small diesel engines have had emissions requirements since the late 1990s. Most guys today refer to no emissions tractors as being those without after-treatment systems on the exhaust to clean up that, what we would know in the tractor industry as Tier 4. But Tier 4 was preceded by Tiers 1 through 3, and all of those had an impact on the way the diesel engines ran. And guys seem to not be attuned to some of those differences. If we go back and we look at some of those early tiers, Tiers 1 through 3 were achieved without aftertreatment on the exhaust. But that doesn't mean that there weren't other things happening on engines as we move through those. I was selling tractors through most of these years and have very clear memories as it seemed like manufacturers were having to roll out model after model after model to keep up with these ever-changing standards. And Tier 1 and Tier 2 happened with very little fanfare. We really weren't detecting a whole lot of changes to the products as those things were being introduced. It was largely engine tuning that was being done. And that tuning was largely addressing a little bit of particulate matter output on the engines and cleaning up the amount of soot and stuff that was coming out, and also work down the amount of CO2 at the same time. The first point that we would have seen the impacts of this engine tuning would have been in Tier 3. Tier 3 came in right about in 2008, and the major mechanical system that was put in place to address emissions in Tier 3 was EGR, exhaust gas recirculation. EGR, when it's used, is going to lower combustion temperatures and impact the efficiency and the fuel economy of the engine a little bit. And we started to notice that. We could see the difference between a Tier 2 and a Tier 3 engine. When Tier 4 came about, Tier 4 was the point that we started to see after-treatment systems put onto the engine, and diesel particulate filters and DEF fluid, all the things that guys are starting to be attuned to today. Tier 4 actually started in 2008 with the lowest horsepower engines, but in 2012, 2013 is when you started to see it a lot more across the board as it rolled into higher horsepower tiers. Tier 4 actually did take care of some of the performance problems that we would have seen with Tier 3. So because we're not having to detune the engines as much as what was happening in Tier 3, Tier 4, being that we're treating most of our emission stuff on the outside of the engine now with after-treatment systems, allowed engine designers in order to tune those engines more efficiently and not run as much EGR. And so we could have engines with better fuel economy now in Tier 4 than what we did in Tier 3. So a lot of guys, when they're looking at tractors, are assuming that Tier 4 is only negatives. That's not actually the case. There are some legitimate engine tuning benefits now because we're treating emissions on the outside, on the after-treatment side of the engine, that are going to enable the engines to run better than what they would have during the Tier 3 time period. So in today's modern emissions standards, when what we would call Tier 4 final, after all of these things have finally been rolled in, we ultimately now have 6 different classifications of engines, and they're broken up by horsepower ranges. Within each one of those classes, there's different requirements for what the engine is allowed to put out of its exhaust. And essentially, smaller engines are allowed to be dirtier than bigger engines are. You're going to notice that there's a lot of tractors sitting right at 26 horsepower, and that's because that's the point. 19 kilowatts is what the standard would be defined as. That's the point at which you start to have a tighter standard that now requires after treatment. Under 26 horsepower, you still have a Tier 4 engine. A lot of guys refer to those tractors as not being Tier 4. They are. They're just in a classification where the manufacturers can meet those requirements without the use of after treatment. Once we go up above 26 horsepower, between 26 and about 75, that's the point where you're able to treat most of your exhaust without DEF fluid. So you're meeting those emission standards with either a DPF, a diesel particulate filter, or a DOC, a diesel oxidation catalyst. Every tractor has one of the two in that 26 to 75 horsepower range. After you go over top of 75 horsepower, that's where the standard starts to clamp down on the PM enough and the NOx enough that it's going to require DEF fluid in order to treat that further. So those engines above 75 horsepower are going to have a combination of a DPF, a diesel particulate filter, and also a DEF treatment system, that blue fluid that you have to dump in, that's going to help clean up that exhaust further. Another change that happened in conjunction with these emission stages was a change in the formulation of diesel fuel. So in the late 2000s, sulfur content in diesel fuel had been dropping, and that's because some of the hardware that was required in these Tier 4 emission stages, namely the absorbent materials in there for cleaning up the exhaust gases and the screens in there for particulate matter, are sensitive to the sulfur content in the fuel. So removing that sulfur content enabled that hardware to work properly because it is sensitive to those components of the fuel. One thing that would have happened on the equipment by dropping that sulfur content is that you remove some of the lubrication from it. Sulfur was a lubricant in the fuel at the time. Modern engines now are pretty much set up that we're going to be expecting that low sulfur content, but if you have an older engine or you just really want to take care of your equipment, a fuel additive in order to boost the lubrication in your fuel is certainly not going to hurt. That stuff is fairly inexpensive. The one that we sell in here in our parts department is about 12 bucks a treat, 250 gallons, and that can be a little bit of insurance policy that you've got that proper lubrication in your fuel to keep your engine healthy. So that's just a real rough run through on how the tiered emission standards have been rolled out over the years. There seems to be a lot of misunderstanding how this stuff works, and also a lot more depth and intricacy to these things than what I dove in this video. You can do a lot of reading and research on this, and I'm sure there's going to be guys out there watching much more knowledgeable about this than I even am, so I'd like to hear your notes down in the comments of how this stuff is rolled out. One note about this from the dealership side, you will hear a lot of grumbling about this stuff online. I can say here at this point today, we feel like we're through most of the problems that emission systems may have had as they have rolled out. The on-road truck industry has had vastly more problems than what we've had with tractors. The large reason for that is because these emission systems work best when they're run hot and hard, and that tends to be what our equipment does. You're running your RPMs high, you're working your equipment, and the emission systems work that much more effectively and efficiently than, say, an on-road truck where you may be nearly idling up and down the highway as you're pulling loads back and forth. So while it's not something that we're necessarily thrilled of, all of these things have been really more complex and vastly more expensive than what the EPA certainly was figuring from what I was seeing. And we are essentially doing good for the environment. When you stand beside these tractors, you're absolutely going to notice that the exhaust on a modern machine is vastly more cleaner than what it ever has been before. Even machines that are run inside, we sell excavators into interior environments for inside demolition and those kinds of things. And those older tiers, we were installing exhaust scrubbers and that kind of stuff so people could work in their equipment. And with Tier 4, that kind of stuff is just not necessary anymore. The exhaust is clean enough coming out of the stack that you can be around the machine and not feel like you're sucking in diesel fumes. So there's benefit to that in the operator, that you don't have that blowing back in your face while you're working. And in Tier 4, like I said, benefits over Tier 3 in the efficiency of that engine, the way that it runs. That's not necessarily a golden ticket to go find a Tier 3 tractor.
So I think Neil did an absolutely phenomenal job introducing this, much better than I could. You know, I don't want to make this video too much longer, but when I was a kid, we had one of the first incineration plants in New York, just a few thousand feet from our home, and it wasn't a real tall stack, and it was right near the shoreline of Lake Ontario, and there were no scrubbers put on these incinerators at that time, and the damage that probably did to our lungs back then was probably pretty significant. The material, depending on how the weather was, there was such large particles that this material would sit on your home, on your vehicles and all, and we used to be really concerned about the acid rain, but it would actually damage the paint coat on the vehicles. And certainly with my first dozer and my first couple of tractors, the fumes that I would be breathing in with those pieces of equipment, things have changed for the benefit so much. It's just amazing. So the nitric oxides that are there, the sulfur oxides, and certainly the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and all, let alone the carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, all of these things are being addressed bit by bit. And you know, in some of these cases, we have to use the DEF in the higher horsepower units. The diesel particulate filter, some of the challenges associated with those, making sure we're running the RPMs, running the engine at a high enough rate that we are burning off that soot that is being captured in the tractor itself, in the filter itself. So I think I won't go through any more at this point as well. there are other videos and images, lots of things online. Volvo has a really nice description. For those of you who want to see this, I'll just play this video to the end so we can see this. So that about sums it all up. I hope this video was helpful for feeling a bit more comfortable about some of the equipment that's out there this day and age, and the changes that have been done, not just for the environment, but for our own health. And certainly I think about school buses and small children and their exposure to these noxious environmental hazards that can do so much damage to our bodies. But this video is running much longer than I'd hoped it had. I hope you all stay healthy, and I hope this was helpful. If it was, give us a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and stay healthy and take care, folks. Feel free to leave any comments down below. Thank you. Bye-bye now.